There is a moment that arrives in the life of every person who has learned to feed on the attention of others, a moment they never see coming because their entire strategy depends on it never arriving. It is the moment they look across the table, across the silence, across the years, into the eyes of the very person they trained to bend, to explain, to apologize for existing, and they realize with a cold drop in the stomach that no charm can undo, that this person is no longer confused, no longer reaching, no longer performing the old familiar dance of self-doubt. This person understands exactly what is happening and understands it better than the one who built the game in the first place. Tonight, I want to tell you what happens inside a person who has spent their whole life mastering the manipulation of feeling. In the exact instant they discover that the one they manipulated has finally learned to read them perfectly. It is not a small thing. It may be one of the most quietly devastating experiences a human psyche can undergo. And by the end of what I have to say, you will understand why. Let us begin, as we always must, in the region beneath the visible personality, the region I have spent a lifetime studying, the region where the true drama of every relationship is actually staged, long before a single word is spoken aloud in the daylight world. Every person wears a face for the world. I have called this the persona, the mask assembled, piece by piece, out of what a particular family, a particular culture, a particular era will tolerate seeing. Most people wear their mask loosely enough that something of the true self still breathes beneath it. But there is a particular psychological structure, one you have likely encountered, perhaps loved, perhaps nearly lost yourself to, in which the mask has grown so thick, so total, so exquisitely maintained, that the person wearing it has forgotten, or perhaps never known, that anything exists underneath it at all. This is the architecture we are speaking of tonight. Not simple vanity, not mere selfishness, something colder and more structural. A self built almost entirely out of reflection, requiring, at every hour, an audience to confirm that it exists. Such a person cannot generate their own sense of being. They must borrow it continuously from the eyes of others. This is why they are drawn, unerringly, unconsciously, to the deepest well they can find. And the deepest well is always the empathic one. The person who feels too much, absorbs too readily, forgives too quickly, explains away cruelty as merely misunderstanding. This person is not chosen by accident. They are chosen the way a parched traveler chooses the deepest water source in a dry country, not out of malice exactly, though the effect is indistinguishable from malice, but out of a desperate, bottomless psychological thirst that has never, not once, been satisfied by anything real. I want you to understand something crucial before we go further, because it changes everything that follows. The relationship between such a person and the empath they have found is not, at first, a battle. It is a language. And like every language, it has to be taught before it can be spoken. In the beginning, the lessons are gentle. Praise offered generously, almost embarrassingly, so the empath feels, for the first time perhaps in their life, truly seen. Attention lavished with an intensity that feels less like flattery and more like recognition, as though someone has finally noticed the very things about you that you were taught quietly over years to hide. This is the first lesson in the language. You are special, and I am the only one who has noticed. Then slowly the grammar changes. The praise becomes conditional. The attention becomes a resource that is given and withdrawn according to a logic the empath cannot quite follow. And so they begin, this is the second lesson, to study, to watch, to learn what pleases and what displeases, what causes the warmth to return and what causes the cold to descend, because the empath's whole nervous system is built for exactly this kind of study. They are extraordinary students of emotional weather. It is, after all, the very gift that made them valuable in the first place. The third lesson is the cruelest and the one that takes the longest to teach because it requires unlearning something sacred, the lesson that their own perception cannot be trusted, that what they saw was not really what happened, that what they felt was an overreaction, that their memory of the cruelty is itself the problem, a distortion, an exaggeration born of their own damaged sensitivity. This is the deepest grammar of the language, the conviction, planted seed by seed, that reality itself is negotiable, and that the negotiation is always, somehow, lost. And here is what I want you to see clearly. Every single one of these lessons is designed, consciously or not, to keep the empath fluent in confusion and illiterate in their own certainty. A person kept permanently unsure of their own perceptions is a person who will keep reaching for reassurance from the very source that keeps taking it away. This is the entire architecture. It does not require cruelty in every moment. It only requires enough unpredictability that certainty itself becomes the rarest resource in the relationship, rarer than love, rarer than peace, rarer even than truth. But here is where the story most people tell about this dynamic goes wrong. And I want to correct it carefully, because the correction matters more than anything else I will say tonight. The empath is not merely a victim absorbing lessons passively, forever, without end. Somewhere in that absorption, and this is the part that so rarely gets named, something else is quietly occurring. The empath, being exactly what they are, is not only learning to doubt themselves, they are also, without meaning to, without even realizing it is happening, becoming a student of the very language being used against them. Every manipulation observed closely enough for long enough eventually becomes legible. Every tactic repeated often enough eventually loses its mystery and becomes simply a pattern. And a pattern, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. This is the turning point I want you to sit with tonight, because it is the hinge on which everything else swings. There comes a day, often after years, sometimes only after the empath has been brought to the very edge of their own dissolution, when something shifts. Not loudly, not with fireworks. It shifts the way weather shifts, so gradually that the person experiencing it can hardly say when the change began. But one day, the empath notices the withdrawal of warmth, and instead of scrambling to understand what they did wrong, simply notices it, observes it, names it silently to themselves. This is the cold phase. This is what always comes after I have been useful. And in that naming, quiet, undramatic, utterly private, something extraordinary has happened. The empath has stopped being a participant in the confusion and become, instead, a witness to the mechanism. Now, I want to speak about what happens on the other side of this shift, because this is the part almost no one describes accurately, and it is the part that gives tonight's subject its true weight. A person whose entire sense of self depends on controlling the emotional reality of another person is exquisitely, catastrophically sensitive to the moment that control begins to fail. Not fail loudly, a scene, a confrontation, an accusation, these, in truth, such a person can manage easily, even relish, because conflict of that kind still centers them as the main character of the story, still gives them something to perform against, still allows them to play the misunderstood one, the wounded one, the one who didn't mean it that way. No. What such a person cannot manage, what genuinely terrifies the structure beneath their mask, is something far quieter, the moment they say something designed to wound, designed to confuse, designed to provoke the old familiar scramble for reassurance, and the empath simply looks at them, calmly, almost with something like compassion, though it no longer feels like warmth, and says nothing at all. Or worse, from their perspective, says something measured, precise, entirely unbothered, that reveals in a single sentence that the entire mechanism has been seen, catalogued, and understood. This is the moment I asked you to imagine at the very beginning. This is the moment I want you to understand from the inside, because understanding it will change how you interpret every silence you have ever been punished for keeping. In that instant, something happens inside the one who built their whole identity on being unreadable while reading everyone else. It is not embarrassment exactly, though embarrassment is part of it. It is closer to what I would call, in the language I have used all my life, to describe the deepest disturbances of the self, an encounter with one's own shadow, except delivered not by their own conscience, which they have spent a lifetime avoiding, but by the very person they assumed would never develop the eyes to see them clearly. There is no defense against this. You cannot charm someone who has stopped needing your charm to feel real. You cannot confuse someone who has learned to recognize confusion as a tactic rather than a truth. You cannot punish someone with withdrawal when they have already quietly withdrawn their own dependence on your presence. The entire apparatus, built over years, refined through repetition, dependent on the other person's continued blindness, simply stops functioning. And a person whose sense of self depends entirely on a functioning apparatus, experiences its failure not as inconvenience, but as a kind of existential vertigo. Who am I if the mirror I have been using no longer distorts the way I need it to? I want to pause here and say something that may surprise you, because it is easy, in a moment like this, to feel only triumph, and triumph, while understandable, is not the whole truth, and I do not want to leave you with only half of it. The person who built their identity this way is not, in most cases, simply choosing cruelty out of some clear-eyed malice. Beneath the manipulation, there is almost always an old and unhealed wound of their own, a self that was never permitted, in its own childhood, to be loved without condition, and so learned, very young, that love must be extracted rather than received, controlled rather than trusted, because trust itself once proved catastrophically unsafe. I do not say this to excuse what was done to you. I say it because understanding the mechanism fully, not just its effect on you, but its origin in them, is what finally allows you to stop taking its cruelty personally. You were never the reason the well was bottomless. You simply happened to be standing near it, with your hands full of water. But understanding the wound behind the behavior does not obligate you to remain within reach of it. This is crucial, and I want to say it plainly. Compassion for the origin of a pattern is not the same as consent to keep being its material. You can hold both truths at once, that this person is, in some deep sense, suffering from an old unhealed injury, and that you are no longer available to be the unpaid physician for a wound you did not create and cannot cure through further sacrifice. Understanding is not the same as staying. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for a wound that only knows how to feed on others is to stop offering yourself as its food. Let us return now to the empath who has learned the language, because this is where the true power of tonight's subject lives, and I do not want you to miss it beneath the drama of confrontation. Learning the language does not mean becoming fluent in cruelty. This is the crucial distinction, the one that separates growth from mere reversal. It would be the easiest thing in the world for someone who has studied manipulation this closely, for this long, to simply turn the same weapons around and use them in return, the same unpredictability, the same withdrawal of warmth as punishment, the same quiet cruelty dressed as composure. Some people, wounded enough, do exactly this, and I understand the temptation completely. But this is not what I mean when I speak of learning the language. I mean something far more sophisticated and far more devastating to the one who taught it in the first place. Learning to recognize the tactic without needing to use it. Learning to see the manufactured confusion for exactly what it is, and simply declining to enter it. Learning to notice the manufactured cold, and instead of scrambling toward the warmth that will inevitably be withdrawn again, simply staying steady in your own internal temperature, warmed by a fire that no longer depends on someone else's permission to burn. This is fluency without corruption. This is the empath who has finally learned to translate the old language into something entirely different. Not retaliation, but recognition. Not cruelty returned for cruelty given, but clarity offered in place of the fog that used to be required for the relationship to continue at all. And I promise you, I have watched this pattern across countless lives, across every era, across every culture I have ever studied. There's nothing on this earth that disarms a manipulator more completely than someone who can see exactly what they are doing, name it calmly, and simply choose not to participate. I want to describe in some detail what this recognition actually looks like when it finally arrives, because I think many of you listening tonight are closer to this moment than you realize, and I do not want you to miss it when it comes. It looks like noticing in real time that a comment designed to make you feel small has landed, and instead of immediately defending yourself, immediately explaining yourself, immediately performing the old ritual of proving your worth all over again, you simply pause. You feel the old reflex rising, the familiar urge to justify, to soften, to make yourself smaller so the moment passes more quickly. And then, for the first time, you notice the reflex instead of obeying it. You watch it the way you might watch weather moving across a distant field, present, real, but no longer something that has to determine what you do next. It looks like receiving praise after a period of coldness, and instead of drinking it in gratefully the way you once did, the way the thirsty always drink whatever water is offered, you notice quietly that the praise arrived exactly when your attention had begun to wander elsewhere. You notice the timing, you notice the pattern, and you receive the praise, if you receive it at all, the way you would receive a gift from someone whose generosity you no longer entirely trust, with politeness perhaps, but without the old flood of relief. It looks like being accused of something you did not do in a way clearly designed to make you doubt your own memory of events. And instead of spiraling into the old exhausting search for the version of reality that will finally satisfy them, you simply say, "That is not what happened," quietly, once, and then you do not repeat it, do not defend it further, do not offer three more explanations in the hope that the fourth will finally land. You say the true thing once, and you let the silence that follows belong to them, instead of scrambling to fill it the way you always used to. This, all of this, is the language finally spoken back, not as a weapon, but as a wall. And a wall, unlike a weapon, requires no aggression to be devastating. It only requires that it does not move. I want to speak now about what happens to the one who taught this language in the weeks and months after they realize their student has surpassed them, because this too is part of the truth, and I do not want to leave it out. There is, first, disbelief, a refusal to accept that the old tactics have stopped working, and so an intensification of them, more charm, more coldness, more manufactured chaos, thrown at the wall of the empath's new steadiness like waves thrown at a cliff that has quite suddenly stopped eroding. This intensification can be frightening to witness because it often looks at first like an escalation of the very cruelty you thought you were finally free from. But I want you to understand it for what it actually is. Not strength, but panic. A structure whose entire foundation depends on the responsiveness of another person, discovering that the responsiveness has genuinely stopped, will often thrash violently before it accepts the new reality. This is not evidence that your steadiness has failed. It is evidence that your steadiness is finally working. Then often there is a strange kind of grief, not always visible, rarely spoken, but real. Because whatever this person's methods, whatever damage they caused, they too have lost something. The one source of reflection that made them feel, however falsely, however temporarily, that they existed. And when that source dries up, they are left, perhaps for the first time in years, alone with the very self they built the entire apparatus to avoid meeting. This is not your responsibility to fix. I say this clearly because I know some of you, even now, even after everything, feel a pull to comfort this grief, to soften this loss, to explain your withdrawal so thoroughly that the pain of it becomes bearable for them. Resist this pull. Their reckoning with their own unmet self is not a task you are qualified or obligated to perform. You did not create the wound. You are not required to stay and dress it. I want to say something now directly to the part of you that has lived this, because I suspect many of you listening tonight are not simply curious about a psychological pattern, but recovering from having lived inside one. You are not naive for having believed the early lessons. The praise that first drew you in was not, at that moment, entirely false. It is entirely possible for a person to be genuinely delighted by you, and still, later, learn to weaponize that delight once they discover its usefulness. Your capacity to be moved by attention is not evidence of foolishness. It is evidence that you are alive, that you are capable of connection, that you have not yet hardened into the kind of person who trusts nothing and no one. This capacity was not your flaw. It was simply for a time mistaken for an opening by someone who specialized in finding them. And you are not cold or cruel or somehow morally diminished for having finally learned to recognize the pattern and to stop rewarding it with your confusion. This, this is not the same thing as becoming what was done to you. There is a vast and important difference between a person who manipulates from a hidden hunger and a person who has simply learned through painful repetition to stop being the meal. One is a strategy for extracting a sense of self from others. The other is the recovery of a self that was nearly extracted entirely. Let me speak now about what becomes possible on the far side of this recognition, because I do not want tonight's subject to end merely in the satisfaction of having outgrown a manipulator. That satisfaction, while real, is only the doorway. What lies beyond it matters more. Once you have learned to see this pattern clearly, once you can recognize the manufactured confusion, the manufactured coldness, the manufactured urgency of a crisis that always seems to require your emotional labor to resolve. You begin to notice something remarkable. How much of your energy, for years, was spent translating a language that was never actually about connection at all. It was about control. And once you stop needing to speak it, an enormous reserve of energy becomes available to you again. Energy that used to disappear entirely into the project of managing someone else's emotional weather, now free to be poured, for the first time in longer than you can remember, into your own life, your own work, your own unclaimed capacities, your own quiet, ordinary joys which were always there, waiting, patient, beneath the noise of the emergency you had mistaken for love. This is what I mean when I speak of the return to wholeness. Not a single dramatic moment of triumph over your former manipulator, but the slow, steady redirection of a life that had been almost entirely organized around someone else's need to be reflected. You will find in time that you no longer need to prove to yourself or to anyone that you have won some invisible contest of who understood whom more completely. The winning was never really the point. The point was always this: to come home to yourself fully without needing anyone's permission to arrive. And so let me leave you tonight with the truth that sits beneath everything I have said. The narcissist's horror in the moment they realize the empath has learned their language is not really about losing an argument or losing control of a single conversation. It is the horror of discovering that the very person they trained to doubt their own perception has, instead, become someone who trusts it completely. It is the horror of watching the mirror they depended on develop its own light, independent of anything they ever gave it. And there is no recovering for such a person from the loss of a mirror that has learned to shine on its own. But I do not want you to walk away from tonight thinking only of their horror. I want you to walk away thinking of your own light, the light that was always there underneath the years of confusion, underneath the doubt that was planted so carefully and for so long that you nearly mistook it for your own voice. It was never your own voice. Your own voice sounds like this, calm in the face of manufactured chaos, clear in the face of manufactured confusion, steady in the face of a coldness that no longer has the power to send you scrambling for warmth you must earn all over again. You did not become fluent in their language to punish them. You became fluent so that you would never again mistake their language for your own thoughts. And now that you know the difference, now that you can hear immediately, unmistakably, when someone is speaking in that old familiar grammar of control, you are free, not free from having been hurt, not free from the grief of what that hurt cost you, but free, finally, to speak only in your own language from now on. The language of a person who knows exactly what they saw, exactly what they felt, and exactly what they are no longer willing to give away. Let them stand outside that language, confused, the way you once stood outside theirs. Let them search for the version of you that used to translate their cruelty into something bearable, and let them fail to find her, because she is not hiding. She has simply gone home, and home, at long last, is where you intend to stay.